Money started moving in the wrong direction, and that's when everyone got uncomfortable. Not because Africa collapsed, not because a crisis exploded, but because something quieter happened. For the first time in years, more money began leaving Africa than entering it, and no one had a clear explanation ready. Headlines used nervous phrases, analysts spoke in careful tones, but the story itself felt unfinished. If this was truly bad news, why wasn't anything breaking? Why were currencies steady, ports open, and government silent? Why did this feel less like failure and more like a phase no one wanted to name? Behind the numbers is a much bigger shift, one that started long before repayments appeared in spreadsheets. It began when China flooded Africa with infrastructure money, then quietly slowed down. It continued when old lenders rushed back in, only to realize the safety net was shrinking. So here's the real curiosity this story opens up. If Africa is no longer living on incoming money, what exactly comes next? Let's find out. What comes next is not collapse. What comes next is context. To understand why money is now leaving Africa, you first have to understand why it entered so aggressively in the first place. China did not wake up one day and decide to help Africa. It moved because it had a structural problem of its own. By the late 2000s, China's economy was expanding faster than the roots that sustained it. Its factories depended on raw materials sourced thousands of miles away. Its exports moved through sea lanes, watched, insured, and indirectly controlled by rival powers. Its energy security relied on choke points it didn't command. That's not a development issue, that's a vulnerability. Africa sat outside that vulnerability map. So when China arrived, it didn't bring NGOs or social programs. It brought engineers, financiers, and timelines. Ports that could load faster and deeper. Railways that could move minerals straight from inland zones to the coast. Power plants that removed dependence on imported electricity. Fiber cables that bypassed Western-controlled digital hubs. This expansion was formalized after 2013 under the Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Xi Jinping. Africa wasn't a side project. It was a geographic solution, a way to shorten routes, secure inputs, and anchor long-term access without military occupation. Africa was accepted because the alternative had already failed. Western financing talked about development but avoided hard infrastructure unless it came with privatization demands, endless feasibility studies, or political conditions. Roads took decades, power projects stalled, ports were underbuilt, China offered speed and scale. But here's the part most commentary avoids saying clearly: those loans were never designed to stay open-ended. Every major project came with a life cycle: construction, operation, revenue, servicing. The inflow phase was always meant to end. The problem is that no one prepared the public for what the next phase looks like, because Africa had rarely been allowed to reach it. This wasn't charity money meant to circulate forever. It was capital meant to build assets that would eventually fund themselves. Once a port starts collecting fees, once a railway moves freight daily, once a power plant sells electricity, the logic flips. Money no longer needs to arrive, it starts to move internally. That's why the inflow slowed. Not because something broke, but because something is finished. And when the building phase ended, something else quietly began. Something far less visible, far less celebrated, and far more uncomfortable for systems that depend on Africa always being in need. So if the inflow phase ended exactly as designed, what did the system see when it looked at Africa's balance sheets for the first time afterward? What the system saw was something it rarely sees in Africa: completion. Once the ports started operating, once trains began moving freight daily, once power plants started selling electricity, the financial picture changed. Not emotionally, not politically, mechanically. Grace periods expired. Repayment schedules activated. Cash began moving in the opposite direction. This is the moment analysts noticed, not because it was sudden, but because it broke a long-standing pattern. For decades, Africa's financial relationship with the outside world followed one script: money in, explanations out. Budgets depended on fresh inflows. Projects stayed ongoing. Development was always described in the future tense. This time, the numbers told a different story. According to reporting by Reuters, Africa shifted from receiving net inflows from China to sending net outflows. Over two comparable periods, the continent swung by roughly $52 billion from a surplus of incoming money to a net transfer outward. That single statistic triggered the panic language. But here's what the number actually reflects, stripped of emotion. Projects reached the revenue phase. Debt moved from abstract obligation to scheduled servicing. Money followed contracts already signed years earlier. This was not a crisis event. It was a post-construction event. The problem is that most global financial commentary has no vocabulary for an Africa that finishes things. The moment Africa stops absorbing capital and starts circulating it internally and outward, the narrative breaks. Because inflows imply need, outflows imply capacity, and capacity shifts power. Once a project can pay its own costs, lenders lose their strongest leverage tool: urgency. There's no immediate refinancing threat, no funding cliff to exploit, no crisis window to force policy changes. That's why this phase felt uncomfortable, not because Africa was losing money, but because Africa was no longer structurally desperate for it. This is also where China's behavior started to confuse observers. Instead of rushing to replace the outgoing money with new loans, China slowed down. Not abruptly, not loudly, but deliberately. New lending volumes dropped. Deals became more selective. The tap wasn't shut, it was tightened. To analysts used to perpetual lending cycles, this looked like withdrawal. But from a project finance perspective, it looked like discipline. China wasn't responding to African weakness. It was responding to asset maturity. The projects it financed were now expected to perform, not be endlessly refinanced. And that's when the real fear set in. Because if Africa no longer needs constant inflows to keep infrastructure alive, then something deeper has changed. The financial relationship is no longer about building, it's about testing. And testing reveals things that permanent inflows conveniently hide. So when repayment replaced construction as the dominant signal, the question stopped being how much money is coming in and became something far more threatening to existing systems. What happens to leverage when Africa no longer needs to borrow just to function? What happens when leverage weakens is simple. Someone tries to replace it. The moment Africa no longer needed fresh Chinese loans just to keep infrastructure alive, a space opened up, not in roads or power plants, but in budget pressure. And global finance knows how to operate in that space very well. This is where multilateral institutions re-entered the frame. Not with cranes, not with rail lines, with balance sheet support. As Chinese lending slowed, these institutions sharply increased their net financing. Over a decade, their net flows jumped by more than 120%, making them the dominant source of development finance once repayments were accounted for. This shift wasn't random. It followed a very old rule: influence follows dependency. Infrastructure financing builds things and then steps back. Budget financing stays close year after year. And budget financing comes with a different kind of leverage. Instead of asking, can this project be completed? The question becomes, can salaries be paid next quarter? That's a far more sensitive pressure point. China's model had moved Africa toward asset-backed independence. Multilateral finance moved in to keep relevance by focusing on fiscal stability, social spending, and short-term funding gaps, areas where governments feel immediate pain if money pauses. This wasn't a replacement for China, it was a change of battlefield. But even here, something felt unstable. Because unlike the past, this return didn't come with unlimited backing. Western governments were facing their own constraints. Domestic politics were shifting. Foreign aid tolerance was thinning. Funding promises were getting shorter. So while multilateral institutions increased their presence, the foundation beneath them was weaker than before. And that's what made this phase dangerous. Africa was no longer dependent on Chinese infrastructure loans, but it wasn't insulated either. The old system could offer stabilization, not transformation. Breathing room, not momentum. This created a strange overlap. Infrastructure was built. Revenue was expected. But safety nets were no longer guaranteed. For decades, Africa existed in a protected contradiction. Unfinished enough to justify aid, but functional enough to survive. That contradiction was dissolving, and when it dissolves, the spotlight moves. Suddenly, it's not about which lender is bigger. It's about whether governments can operate without constant external cushioning. Multilateral institutions can stabilize budgets temporarily. They cannot replace performance. That's when the real tension started to surface. Because if China were stepping back from loans and multilateral money was conditional and finite, then something Africa had rarely experienced became unavoidable. What happens when the financial buffers themselves start thinning? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. What happens is that pressure stops being theoretical. For a long time, African governments operated with at least one cushion underneath them. If infrastructure stalled, loans could be renegotiated. If budgets ran thin, aid or emergency financing could plug the gap. If projects underperformed, time itself became an excuse. There was always something external to lean on. That cushion started thinning quietly, not because Africa changed, but because the outside world did. Western governments began cutting foreign aid. Development agencies were scaled down. Budget allocations shrank, not with dramatic announcements, but with paperwork and silence. The message wasn't hostile. It was indifferent. Priorities had moved elsewhere. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the timing couldn't have been worse or more revealing. China had already slowed new lending, expecting built projects to carry themselves. Multilateral institutions had stepped in, but with limits and conditions. And now the final layer, unconditional aid, was receding. This wasn't a collapse, it was exposure. Without cushions, governments face reality faster. Public services must be funded internally. Infrastructure must generate revenue, not just exist. Political promises suddenly require cash, not explanations. This is why analysts started using phrases like net negative. Not because Africa was poorer than before, but because failure could no longer be postponed. Inflow-heavy systems allow delay. Exposure forces outcomes. And outcomes don't care about narratives. Hospitals either operate or they don't. Electricity grids either collect payments or collapse. Transport networks either move goods profitably or bleed money. This phase doesn't reward ideology or alignment. It rewards execution. That's why this moment feels tense but strangely quiet. There's no singular crisis to point at, no dramatic default, no single villain. Just a narrowing corridor where competence matters more than access. And here's the detail that rarely gets acknowledged. This phase is politically dangerous. When external money shrinks, citizens stop arguing with donors and start arguing with leaders. Blame shifts inward. Excuses wear thin. Performance gaps become visible in real time. That's not something financial systems enjoy observing, because it produces unpredictability. Some governments will adjust quickly. Some will struggle. Some will be exposed brutally. But while all eyes were fixed on shrinking aid and tightening budgets, one assumption quietly broke apart: the idea that China would disappear once lending slowed. It didn't, which raises the next question, the one most people missed while watching inflows fall. If China wasn't pulling away, what exactly was it repositioning itself to do? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What China repositioned itself to do was stop carrying risk and start measuring results. When lending slowed, many assumed China was backing away. That assumption missed the shift entirely. China didn't leave Africa's economy. It moved inside it. Instead of pushing more sovereign loans, it leaned into construction contracts, equity stakes, and revenue-linked investments. Less money is handed to governments. More money is tied directly to assets that either work or don't. This is a quiet but brutal change. Loans absorb political failure. Assets expose it. In 2025, this shift became visible in the numbers. China's overseas deal-making hit record levels, but the composition changed. Fewer broad loans, more project-specific engagement. Africa emerged as the largest recipient, not because it was weak, but because it was ready to be tested. A port that collects fees doesn't care about speeches. A railway that moves freight doesn't respond to ideology. A power plant that sells electricity doesn't survive on alignment. China repositioned itself where excuses don't function. This wasn't generosity. It was an expectation. By moving away from blanket lending, China effectively said, the infrastructure phase is over. Now comes the phase where systems must perform under real conditions, including pricing, maintenance, governance, and demand. And here's why that matters. When China was lending heavily, failure could always be explained as still developing. Refinancing was an option. Delays were tolerable. Now with revenue-linked projects, performance is binary. Either cash flows or it doesn't. This is where the pressure shifts entirely onto local management. China no longer needs to argue with governments. It only needs to watch numbers. If an asset performs, China benefits. If it doesn't, the problem isn't geopolitical. It's operational. That's a much colder relationship. And it sends a message that goes far beyond China. Africa is no longer being treated as permanently fragile. It's being treated as structurally responsible. This is also why the story doesn't fit old narratives. There's no debt trap drama when loans slow. There's no withdrawal panic when contracts surge. The relationship doesn't look emotional anymore. It looks transactional. That's uncomfortable for systems used to managing Africa through perpetual assistance, because transactions don't respond to sympathy. They respond to outcomes. And now, with China repositioned, multilateral buffers thinning, and aid shrinking, Africa is standing in a narrow corridor where only one thing matters. Which brings us to the final, unavoidable question this entire shift points toward. If no one is carrying Africa anymore, not China, not donors, not lenders, who is actually ready to perform when results are the only currency left? The answer is uncomfortable, uneven, and unavoidable. Not everyone is ready, and that's the point of this phase. This moment isn't designed to protect weak systems. It's designed to expose them. When no one is carrying Africa anymore, not China with easy loans, not donors with endless aid, not institutions with permanent cushions, the environment changes instantly. Politics stops being about alignment and starts being about delivery. Power stops coming from access to money and starts coming from the ability to make systems work. This is the phase Africa has rarely been allowed to enter. In earlier eras, failure could always be externalized. If projects stalled, it was donor fatigue. If services collapsed, it was due to funding gaps. If debt rose, it was unfair global structures. Some of those explanations were valid, many still are, but they also delayed something critical: internal reckoning. Now, that delay is gone. Infrastructure exists. Assets are operational. Money is no longer automatic. So results take center stage. This is why the moment feels tense but not explosive. There's no single breaking point because this isn't a crash. It's a sorting process. Governments that can collect revenue, manage assets, and maintain systems will stabilize. Those who can't will struggle quickly, visibly, and without cover. And here's the detail that matters most for young Africans. This phase doesn't reward ideology. It doesn't reward rhetoric. It rewards competence. That's why this shift scares so many systems at once. A results-driven Africa is harder to influence, harder to predict, and harder to manage from the outside. You can't pressure a country through aid cuts if it doesn't rely on aid. You can't dictate terms through loans if projects are self-financing. You can't control narratives when performance is measurable. This is also why the story keeps getting framed as net negative. Because exposure feels dangerous, especially to those who benefited from opacity. But exposure also creates something rare: clarity. Citizens can see what works and what doesn't. Leaders can no longer hide behind global excuses. Institutions can no longer pretend that money alone fixes governance. The feedback loop tightens. Some countries will adapt fast. Some will stumble. Some will face political consequences they can't outsource. That's not a collapse. That's transition, the hardest kind. So this story was never really about China, loans, or even money direction. It's about Africa crossing a line most regions cross quietly. the moment when survival funding ends and performance begins. Which leaves only one final question, the one this entire shift forces into the open. When results become the only language that matters, which African systems and which leaders will still be standing? Let us know in the comment section what leaders caused this change. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.